Have you ever prayed about something you knew deep down you shouldn't? Something so heavy that it made you doubt your own faith? I prayed. I knelt on the floor and asked God to take my husband's life. Yes, you heard that right. A Christian woman, active in the church, with an open Bible in her lap and her knees on the floor, but with a broken heart. And in that moment, I no longer wanted redemption. I wanted justice, or at least what I thought was justice. My name is Michelle Carter. I'm 42 years old, and what you're about to hear here today isn't a tale of overcoming adversity with a cute ending. It's a real story of flesh, blood, and a shattered soul. I was betrayed, abandoned, silenced, and worse, judged, not only by the man who promised to love me, but also by the very person who should have welcomed me, inside the church. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt invisible in your own marriage? Or worse, have you ever felt like no one believed your pain because you were still smiling in Sunday photos? Stay with me until the end, because maybe your story isn't as different from mine as you imagine. For a long time, I kept this to myself, because I was ashamed, because I thought a true Christian didn't feel anger, didn't desire evil, didn't rebel against God. But when adultery knocked on my door, when I saw my marriage crumble, my faith shaken, and my dignity challenged by people who wielded verses as weapons, I realized there was another pain, that of being a Christian and yet wanting to disappear. I never imagined I would pray for revenge. I never thought my most desperate prayer would also be my darkest. But it was there. It came from my mouth. It rose to the heavens like a cry for help camouflaged in fury. And maybe, just maybe, you understand exactly what I mean. What you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps even set you free. Because what happened after that prayer was something even I couldn't have predicted. I was that woman. Everyone held up as a role model, always smiling, always available, always with a word of faith on the tip of her tongue. The wife who arrived early to services, organized women's tea parties, decorated the church at Christmas, and, at the end of the day, still prepared dinner with praise playing softly in the kitchen. My name always came with accolades like dedicated servant, woman of prayer, home warrior. And you know what's craziest? Part of me truly believed that if I did everything right, if I was good enough, faithful enough, submissive enough, nothing bad would ever happen to me. For a long time, I confused religious routine with intimacy with God. My day began with devotions and ended with intercession for my marriage. It was as if I had made an invisible contract with heaven. If I do everything right, the Lord will protect my home. But the hidden truth behind this belief is that it left me vulnerable. I thought prayer was armor, when in fact, it was just one of the pillars of faith. I didn't see, or perhaps I didn't want to see, that my marriage was already being corroded from within. Small actions, cold responses, his absence from church, repeated excuses. But I rationalized everything. He's tired. Men are just like that. The enemy wants to test me. But there was a much harsher truth waiting to be faced. My commitment wasn't being reciprocated, and yet I insisted on carrying everything on my shoulders as if love were a woman's exclusive burden. It's strange to look back and realize that I was living a reality that only existed in my head. Behind the scenes, my home was silence, isolation, and a solitude that I tried to fill with ministry work. I was so occupied with the things of God that I stopped noticing what was happening under my own roof. The impact of this was subtle at first, like cracks in a wall that still seems solid. But one day, everything crumbles. I remember exactly the night something inside me broke. The way he looked at me, like someone looking at a stranger. That was more painful than any scream. It was as if I was no longer needed, not as a wife, not as a woman, not as a presence. And there, for the first time, I felt that no matter how much I prayed, how much I gave of myself, something much greater than myself was moving, and it wasn't the Holy Spirit. For the first few years, it felt like I was living a divinely written script. You know that feeling of having done everything right and reaping the rewards? That's how I felt. When I married David, everything made sense. He was kind, helpful, participated in church activities with me, said prayers before meals, and said things every Christian woman dreams of hearing. You are the answer to my prayers. I truly believed our marriage was a promise fulfilled, a perfect plan from God that had finally manifested in my life. The people around us constantly reinforced this. Blessed couple, an example of partnership. You two were made for each other. And me? I absorbed every compliment as a seal of divine approval. I felt secure, as if that relationship were foolproof simply because it began with prayer, fasting, and purpose. But what no one sees, what doesn't show in the pretty Sunday photos or posts with romantic verses, is what's behind the scenes. The raw part, the first cracks that silently appear, too small to call a problem, but deep enough to initiate a change in mindset. I remember nights when he'd come home late and say it was company work, but the expression on his face wasn't tiredness, but rather coldness. Little by little, he began to withdraw from church. First, he stopped going to the couples' meetings, then the Sunday ones, until one day, he simply stopped praying with me. And no matter how many times I asked, he always gave vague answers. There was never a fight. There was never a confession. Just a growing absence, as if he were disconnecting from me inside, slowly but steadily. But I, trapped in this idea of a perfect marriage, tried to convince myself it was just a phase. I prayed more. I fasted. I read books on the role of a virtuous wife. I questioned myself. Am I being understanding enough? Am I failing to fulfill something God expects of me? And that's where a truth comes in that hurts to admit. When we idealize too much, we ignore the real signs. I didn't realize that what I called fidelity to the promise was actually fear of facing the possibility that that promise had been broken. It's strange to think how much we can cling to an illusion just to keep a story that no longer makes sense alive. I believed so strongly that this was the right man that I didn't consider for a second that perhaps he was just acting from the same script, and that, at some point, he had decided to leave the scene without telling me. While I continued trying to keep the original storyline alive, he was already writing another one. Far from me, far from God, far from what we had promised at the altar. But you know those little signs we insist on calling in our heads? That intuition that whispers, but we silence with a verse or the excuse that it's being too exaggerated? They were there, present, clear, but I refused to face them. The cell phone face down, the strange smiles for messages I never saw, the strange smells on the shirt, the sudden mood swings. Nothing screamed cheating outright, but the whole thing created a scenario that made me uncomfortable. But I had trained myself to ignore discomfort. After all, discomfort isn't an argument in a blessed marriage, right? I thought discernment was just about detecting spirits, when in fact, the Holy Spirit was already showing me, with love, but also with clarity, that something was deeply wrong. And even then, I preferred to think it was just fatigue, stress, a phase. Every woman, at some point in her journey, chooses to close her eyes because looking straight ahead would require a complete transformation in the way she loved, the way she thought, the way she positioned herself. I wasn't ready, and to be honest, I didn't want to mess with what, from the outside, seemed peaceful. But the hidden truth that would take me months to admit was that my fear wasn't of the betrayal itself. It was of what the betrayal revealed about me, about the image I'd built, about the emotional dependence I'd hidden behind faith. Because when the truth finally burst open, it wasn't discreet, it wasn't gentle, it was brutal. The betrayal didn't come through a confession. It came through an oversight, a message opened on his computer, a sentence that left no room for interpretation. It was a shock, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and relief. Yes, as strange as it may seem, I felt a momentary sense of relief, because I could finally stop doubting myself. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't insecure. I wasn't difficult to deal with. I was being betrayed, yes, and it had a name. The impact of this discovery wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual. It was as if everything I had built in prayer was crumbling in slow motion before my eyes. I found myself questioning everything, every decision, every ignored signal, every moment I silenced my own voice in the name of a distorted submission. I felt anger at him, anger at myself, and to my surprise, anger at God too, because in my mind, I had done everything right. I was the faithful wife, the woman of faith, the one who wouldn't leave the altar, and yet I was left behind. I was betrayed by the one I loved most. The most painful part? Discovering it wasn't the first time. that the betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg, and that behind the man of God image lay a series of well-crafted lies, justified with spiritual phrases, covered by a carefully nurtured reputation. That's when my mind went into overdrive. Because it's one thing to deal with error. It's another to face manipulation disguised as holiness. From that moment on, what I thought was pain turned into something even more difficult to manage: confusion, a whirlwind of thoughts, doubts, and distorted memories that prevented me from understanding exactly where everything began to go awry. And it was at that point that everything inside me began to crumble. I no longer knew where the truth ended and the performance began. What had once been our testimony now seemed like a fiction concocted to fit religious standards. And the hardest thing to accept was that I had participated in this farce, not out of bad faith, but out of fear. Fear of admitting that my marriage wasn't what it seemed. Fear of disappointing those who admired me. Fear of not being able to start over. All along, I thought I was fighting for love. But deep down, I was fighting against myself, against the silence that screamed ever louder. I remember looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing who I was. The strong, confident, faith-filled woman was now tired, confused, torn apart inside. The pain was real, but I still had to smile in the church aisle, still had to say it's okay when someone asked. And this dissonance between what I felt and what I showed made me sicken in silence. There was a moment when I thought, if this is the price of being faithful, is it worth it? I know that, as I say this, many women may be reading between the lines. And if you've made it this far and this story resonated with something deep inside you, if at any point this account made you take a deep breath, bite your lip, or swallow hard, I want to ask you one thing. Like this video, not because it's just another piece of content on the internet, but because each like helps this message reach other women who are experiencing what I experienced, in silence, with guilt, with shame. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and continue to bring real stories without spiritual makeup, with truth, vulnerability, and faith. And if this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated with you. Sometimes, what you share might be exactly what another woman needs to hear. In that moment of discovery, my mind couldn't organize anything else. Only flashes came to me. Our wedding ring, the vows at the altar, the promises of "until death do us part." Everything seemed distant, almost ridiculous. I wanted to scream, but the scream wouldn't come out. It stayed stuck in my chest like a wave that wouldn't break. And then came the decision that completely changed the course of my journey. When I found out he had another woman, the ground didn't crack, he disappeared. And the strangest thing is, it wasn't with screams or scandals. It was with a coldness that paralyzed me. It wasn't just the fact that he'd cheated on me. It was where, with whom, and how. Because she was there, inside the same church, attending the same services, sitting just a few pews away, singing the same praises as me. And that cut me apart inside in a way I'd never felt before. It's a pain that mixes humiliation, disbelief, and a kind of loneliness that can't be explained in simple words. I wondered, how come no one saw? How come no one suspected? How did he have the courage? And most of all, how did I not realize it before? The hidden truth is that, deep down, part of me knew, but I didn't want to see it, because accepting it meant facing a transformation I wasn't ready for. It was easier to continue pretending it was just a difficult phase, that God would restore, that, somehow, all of this would become a testimony. But that day, when the truth lay before me, without masks, without metaphors, I understood that some decisions aren't about giving up on the other person. They're about surviving yourself. He denied it at first, of course. He said it was all in my head, that I was being influenced by jealous people, that I was sinning by judging. Words so cold they chilled me to the core. It was as if I were talking to a stranger, someone who had never truly known me. And even when he was cornered by the evidence, texts, calls, witnesses, he still tried to spiritualize the mistake. And do you know what was cruelest? Hearing from him that it was my fault, that I'd become distant, that I was more concerned with church matters than with our home. The reversal was so absurd that, for a few minutes, I wondered if it was true, if perhaps I had truly stopped being good enough. This mental confusion is one of the most perverse impacts of betrayal. It disorganizes who you are. It throws you into a place of doubt, guilt, and fragility. And worst of all of this mixed with faith, because I prayed. I prayed every day. I prayed for his life, for our marriage, for the ministry, for wisdom. And now it all seemed in vain, as if God had remained silent while I begged for direction. It was a breaking point. From that moment on, I no longer knew what to ask of God. I no longer wanted restoration. I no longer wanted explanations. I just wanted to stop feeling that pain. I just wanted to sleep and wake up with a clear mind, without that knot in my stomach and that taste of deception in my mouth. And it was at that moment that the darkest prayer of my life was born. A prayer I never imagined could come from the mouth of someone like me, but it did. And what happened next was the beginning of a journey that completely changed the way I view faith, marriage, and myself. The pain of betrayal wasn't enough. The disappointment with him was already a crushing burden. But what came from where I least expected it was what truly tore me apart. Some sisters from the church, women I'd previously seen as spiritual advisors, beacons of faith, safe havens, looked me in the eye and said, without hesitation, "You need to forgive and fight for him." They didn't ask how I was. They didn't want to understand what had happened. They didn't care about the size of the abyss I was trying to climb alone. For them, the important thing was to maintain the image of the marriage, the appearance of unity, even if everything inside was falling apart. It was at that moment that I discovered how much female silence can hurt. Not the silence that welcomes, but the silence that judges. The silence that refuses to listen. The silence that pretends it doesn't concern him. The silence that prioritizes the pulpit's reputation over the restoration of the soul. I found myself swallowed up by ready-made phrases, verses thrown like stones, and advice disguised as healing, that in practice only pushed me deeper into guilt. It was as if his mistake had become my burden, as if I were responsible for saving a marriage he himself had destroyed. And if I couldn't, it was because I hadn't prayed enough. This kind of toxic spiritualization is sneaky. It sneaks behind the scenes of faith and disguises itself as piety. But it's control, it's oppression, it's the kind of religiosity that kills in the name of salvation. And in that moment, surrounded by eyes that only saw what they wanted to preserve, I felt invisible, screaming inside, but soundless. Because there was no room to listen, there was only one script to follow. The wounded wife must forgive, smile, pray more, and wait, always wait. But what if waiting makes you sick? What if forgiveness is demanded as a shortcut to avoid confronting the truth? What if fighting for it means betraying yourself every day? These questions began to eat away at me. I had faith. I had a lot of faith. But he also had open scars. He had insomnia. He was ashamed. I felt like I was being thrown into a courtroom where the sentence had already been decided, and I was to blame. Guilty for being hurt. Guilty for not being able to get over it. Guilty for wanting to breathe away from it. It was in this scenario that I began to realize something profound about spiritual freedom. That it's not about doing whatever you want, but about ceasing to live under the weight of others' expectations. That not every prayerful voice comes from a place of love, and that sometimes true faith requires the courage to step away, not for revenge, but for self-preservation. It was this revelation that turned the tide. Because there, in that place where no one wanted to hear my cry, I began to listen to my own soul for the first time in a long time. I was removed from the worship team, and it wasn't with care or empathy. It was with a judgmental silence and an excuse disguised as zeal. You are emotionally unstable. That hurt more than I expected, because it wasn't just about singing. It was about belonging. It was the place where I met God amidst the chaos, where I breathed a little relief amidst the storm, where my voice, even trembling, was still mine. And suddenly, they didn't even let me have that. They turned my pain into a reason for exclusion, as if it were a sin to feel, as if lamenting in public were a scandal, not humanity. I wondered silently, since when did the church become a place where only those who are well fit? Since when did fragility become a sign of a lack of faith? It was as if suffering had to be lived within four walls, hidden, stifled, denied, so that the image of the ministry would remain intact. But the hidden truth behind all this is that it wasn't about instability. It was about discomfort. I was uncomfortable because my story broke the script, because it wasn't pretty, because it didn't fit into the Sunday morning smiles. This mentality of silencing, disguised as spiritual order, is cruel. It doesn't welcome. It pushes you away, and it even convinces you it's out of love. But love that hurts and silences isn't love. It's control. It's fear of facing the real impact that pain has on structures, traditions, and narratives that insist on keeping everything as it always was, even though it's corroded from within. They removed me from the pulpit as if they were sparing me. But what they did was tell me, without words, that my vulnerability was inconvenient, that my grief was disrupting their schedule, and strange as it may seem, it was there that I began to wake up. Because when the place that should be a refuge becomes a stage for rejection, you're forced to look within, to reconsider decisions, to confront truths you've long tried to avoid. It was in this rupture that a new mindset began to emerge. Not a revolt, but a clarity. The clarity that not all separation is loss. Sometimes it's deliverance, that there are behind the scenes details of ministry that not everyone has the courage to expose, but that need to be brought to light. That there is a journey of silent reconstruction taking place in many women, while the spotlight continues to shine on those who know how to pretend best. I began to realize that there is something profoundly sacred in the act of feeling, that tears don't disqualify you, that pain doesn't drive you from the altar, that there is strength in those who allow themselves to break and still remain. Because true praise doesn't depend on a microphone. It is born in the heart of those who, even bleeding, choose not to give up. There was a day when the ground seemed more trustworthy than anyone around me. It was cold, hard, silent, but at least it didn't judge me. I knelt there, alone, feeling the weight of everything I carried in my body and soul, and I prayed the most bitter prayer of my life. It wasn't pretty, nor theologically correct. It was raw, real, desperately sincere. I said, "If the Lord wants to take him, I accept." That sentence still haunts me today, because I didn't want to be that woman. I never dreamed I'd get to that point, but I did. Not out of malice, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of exhaustion, from seeing my feelings being nullified, my dignity trampled upon, my sanity tested day after day. It was as if everything I believed about love had been swallowed by a storm of lies, manipulation, and silence. And most cruelly, all of this against a spiritual backdrop, as if praying, fasting, and smiling in public were enough to heal wounds that were bleeding silently, as if my pain had an expiration date, as if my patience were a divine obligation. But no one knew what was going on behind the scenes. No one saw the sleepless nights, the bodies trembling with anxiety, the dark thoughts that began to invade the mind with frightening ease. No one heard the muffled scream that said, "I can't take it anymore." And it was on that cold floor, in that moment of internal collapse, that something inside me began to change. It wasn't a pretty change, nor was it quick, but it was real. There, I stopped asking God to fix what was destroying me, and I started asking for the strength to get out of there alive. It was a shift in mindset, one of those moments no one posts on social media, but which carries an impact that transforms the course of an entire journey. I stopped praying for an external miracle and started crying out for an internal rebuilding. Because deep down, I knew, if something didn't change within me, I would lose myself forever. This bitter prayer was the beginning of a hidden truth I needed to face. Sometimes, liberation doesn't come in the form of reconciliation. It comes in the form of the courage to let go, the discernment to stop fighting alone for something that only existed through my own efforts, and perhaps most difficult, accepting that love can also mean letting go, that forgiveness isn't about staying, and that faith isn't about ignoring reality. It's about facing it with open eyes. It was in this uncomfortable place that God began to show me that even without a pulpit, without a ring on my finger, and without ready-made answers, there was still purpose. There was still life. There was still a woman inside, suffocated, yes, but with a strength that time, trauma, and abandonment could not destroy. After that prayer, a wave of silence washed over me. It wasn't peace, it was a heavy emptiness, filled with questions I'd never asked before. I felt like the worst Christian in the world. Guilt seemed to crush me inside. I looked at my hands and thought, how did I have the courage to ask God for this? It was as if I had crossed a line that no woman of faith should cross. I spent days wondering what kind of disciple I was, what kind of wife, what kind of example for other women in the church. The words forgiveness, grace, and restoration rang like hammers in my head. It felt like I had failed in the most important role expected of me, to be the woman who endures everything in silence, who prays until the end, who doesn't let herself be shaken. But the hidden truth was that I had been shaken for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. I was ashamed of myself, ashamed for feeling angry, for wishing he would go away, for dreaming of a life without him, ashamed for imagining a liberation that, to everyone around me, seemed like sin. It was as if spirituality had become a prison made of ready-made phrases and unattainable expectations, which convince us that being strong in God means never breaking, never questioning, never saying enough. I remember opening the Bible in search of answers and feeling even more lost, because with each verse about forgiveness, a feeling of condemnation came, until one day I realized it wasn't God accusing me. It was the voice of a system that taught me to suppress my emotions in the name of a holiness that only works in theory. This revelation was hard, but liberating, because it made me understand that faith isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to get up, even when everyone expects you to stay down. But this awakening didn't happen all at once. It was as if I were traversing an internal desert, filled with echoes of judgments I'd repeated to myself. I was still afraid of what people would say, afraid of being seen as a bitter woman, as someone who had lost faith. And it was in this mixture of shame and exhaustion that I began to realize that the true gospel isn't about appearances, but about real transformation, the kind that teaches us to see the truth, even when it hurts, and to make decisions that no one understands, but that save our own lives. It was then, in the silence of my room, that I began to pray differently, not for him to change, but for me to have the courage to change. And it was from this subtle shift, almost invisible to outsiders, that my journey began to take a new direction. I entered a place I never thought I'd experience firsthand. Rock bottom didn't hit with a loud bang. It came gradually, like turning off the lights in a room one by one until you realize you're in total darkness. I stopped going to church. I stopped praying. It was as if I'd lost the password to speak to God, and even when I tried, the words wouldn't come. I isolated myself. I avoided people. I avoided questions. I avoided looks that, even unintentionally, reminded me of what I'd lost. Depression wasn't just sadness. It was a constant weight, a feeling of being disconnected from life. Simple things like getting out of bed or responding to a text message seemed like demands too great for me. I felt empty, invisible, and at the same time filled with pain. It was like carrying a body that no longer wanted to move, while my mind silently repeated that nothing made sense. The scariest thing was realizing how distant faith, which had always been my refuge, seemed. Not because God had abandoned me, but because I couldn't get close to him. I was ashamed of feeling this way. How could someone who had led ministries, who had counseled other women, now be so broken? This internal pressure was cruel. I judged myself even more than I judged the people around me. During this time, I began to see behind-the-scenes aspects of my own life that I had never noticed before. I realized how lost I had become trying to be the perfect wife, the model Christian, the strong woman everyone expected. And the more I sought to please everyone, the further I distanced myself from myself. This revelation was painful, but necessary, because it was there, in that state of complete emotional exhaustion, that transformation began to take its first steps, almost imperceptibly. I didn't have the strength to make any big decisions at that moment, but something inside me started to question, is this the life God really has for me? Has he called me to be just a pretty picture on the church wall while I die inside? These questions were like tiny sparks in the darkness. They weren't answers, but they were a sign that somehow I was still alive. And it was in this mix of pain, emptiness, and questioning that I began to understand that sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to realize there's a way out, even if, at that moment, I couldn't yet see where it was. It was a silent dawn when the whole house was asleep, and I, once again, stared at the dark ceiling, feeling that suffocating emptiness. I grabbed the Bible with almost no strength, like someone clutching something just to keep from drowning. And there, without looking for anything specific, my eyes fell on a verse I knew by heart but had never truly understood. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart. Psalm 34:18. In that moment, something inside me crumbled. The tears came uncontrollably. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, I knew for certain that God still loved me. Not because I was strong, nor because I was acting the right way, but precisely because I was broken, without masks, without the armor of the perfect woman I had maintained for years. It was then that I realized that grace doesn't require appearances. It finds us exactly where no one else wants to be. I felt He was there with me, not pointing out my mistake, but holding my broken heart as if to say, I never left. This revelation touched me in a way no preaching had ever done before. At that moment, I understood that God wasn't waiting for me to pull myself together before accepting me. He wanted me whole, including all the cracked and aching parts. That changed everything, because it showed me that true faith isn't about never falling, but about trusting even when everything around you seems to be crumbling. Little by little, I began to pray again. They weren't pretty or elaborate prayers. They were simple, sincere conversations, sometimes just an, I don't know what to do. But each word seemed to open a crack for hope to enter again. It was as if, within all that darkness, a small flame had been lit. I won't say everything was resolved that day. It wasn't a magical turning point, but it was the beginning of a different journey, where I finally stopped trying to prove myself to others and began seeking the truth about who I was to God. This shift in mindset had a silent but powerful impact. For the first time in a long time, I felt there was still a path, that there was still a future, even if I didn't know exactly where it would lead. Realizing that God still loved me, even in that state I found myself in, was like breathing after a long time underwater. It was liberating to understand that I didn't need to have all the answers or be well to be welcomed by Him. This was one of the greatest revelations of my journey. Grace doesn't require performance. It meets us exactly where we are. And you know, as I tell all this, I think about how many women might be going through something similar right now. How many are trying to smile while their hearts are breaking? That's why I believe so strongly in the power of sharing stories like this. Because when we share what we've experienced, someone on the other side realizes they're not alone. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, or even your own experience. Reading your feelings helps transform this space into a true community, where we support and strengthen each other. Often, a word from you can be exactly what another woman needs to read to find hope again. And as I gradually reconnected with God, I began to realize that this difficult phase, painful as it was taking me to a place of transformation that I had never imagined. Over time, I began to see everything from a new perspective. I had spent years believing that my greatest mission was to keep my marriage together, no matter what. I prayed, fasted, and deprived myself, believing that if I were a perfect wife, God would honor my efforts and restore everything. But that early morning of sincere tears, when I finally felt embraced by God, was the beginning of a silent transformation within me. It was as if, little by little, He was revealing to me a hidden truth I hadn't wanted to see. God never asked me to carry the weight of a marriage that was destroying me alone. The faith I had built was based on the idea that true love meant limitless sacrifice. But in that painful process, I realized He didn't want me trapped in something that separated me from who I truly was in Him. The revelation that most freed me was understanding that God's will wasn't for me to save my marriage at any cost, but rather for me to save my own soul, that my life had value, and that I didn't need to continue in a relationship that harmed my identity, my peace, and my faith. That broke me again, but this time in a different way. It wasn't despair. It was as if a light had finally turned on at the end of that tunnel. When I realized this, the guilt began to fade. I understood that admitting my marriage was over wasn't a failure. The real failure would have been staying in that place of pain, denying myself just to maintain the appearance of a perfect life. This shift in mindset was liberating because I began to look at my story with more compassion and less judgment. It was at that moment that I began making decisions that previously seemed impossible. Decisions that directly impacted my future, but which now came with a strange and profound peace. Not because it was easy, but because finally I was aligned with what God truly wanted for me. And it's incredible how, when we understand this, everything begins to take on new meaning. Life stops being just about surviving and becomes about starting over with purpose. I was no longer trying to rescue an idealized version of myself or my marriage. I was ready to build something new, even without knowing yet where it would all lead. It took me a long time to change the way I prayed. At first, every word I spoke was filled with anger, revolt, and unanswered questions. I would kneel and say things like, "Lord, make him pay for everything he did to me." But as the days went by, I realized these prayers only held me even closer to the past. It was as if I were keeping alive within myself the same wound I so desperately wanted to forget. And then, one day, in silence, I realized I needed to pray differently. I began to ask for something that had previously seemed impossible: healing, not for him, but for myself. I asked God to remove from within me the bitterness that consumed me, the weight that left me breathless. It was a slow, sometimes painful process, because letting go of my anger seemed, in some way, to justify what he did. But little by little, I understood that forgiving wasn't justifying. It was freeing myself. This transformation began from the inside out. Each day, I chose not to entertain thoughts of revenge. I felt as if a weight was lifted from my chest. I began to see that my identity was no longer tied to the title of betrayed wife, nor to the history of pain I carried. It was as if God was reteaching me how to live, to make new choices, to build a new mindset. And interestingly, as my heart began to lighten, I realized my outlook on the future also changed. I no longer wanted to waste my energy trying to prove anything to anyone, or show the church that I was strong or perfect. I just wanted peace. This decision had a huge impact on every area of my life because it made me see myself as someone worthy of love and care. There were days when I still cried, of course. Pain doesn't disappear overnight, but with each sincere prayer for healing, I felt a piece of my story being restored, not in the sense of returning to how it was before, but of being rebuilt in a completely new way. This journey was full of behind-the-scenes moments no one saw: sleepless nights, deep conversations with myself, difficult decisions that only I knew how much they cost. And it's funny how, when we begin to see things clearly, we realize that many of the truths we were taught weren't exactly what God intended for us. I grew up hearing that a virtuous woman endures everything, and that praying without ceasing was the solution to any pain. But in that moment, I understood that true faith wasn't about keeping myself in an emotional prison, but rather trusting that God had something much greater prepared for me. This new way of praying brought me freedom, a freedom that didn't come from an instant miracle, but from small, daily decisions. It was like learning to walk again, step by step, until I realized that, even with the scars, I was stronger. And from then on, something inside me began to blossom in a way I never imagined possible. Signing the divorce papers felt like putting an end to a book I never intended to write, but somehow needed to finish. It was strange to realize that, after so many years, that legal, emotional, and spiritual bond was being undone. Part of me still trembled, as if afraid I was committing an irreparable sin. But deep down, something told me I wasn't being rejected by God. On the contrary, He was leading me on a path of restoration I would never be able to follow if I remained trapped in that relationship. I remember the feeling of leaving the audience and taking a deep breath, as if the air had become lighter. There was no euphoria, no sense of victory. It was more like a quiet, discreet, yet deeply real liberation. It was then that I realized that starting over isn't about forgetting the past, but about learning to live without being a slave to it. Every decision I made from that day on had a huge impact on my mindset. For the first time, I was choosing for myself, not based on what was expected of me, not based on what the church wanted to see, not based on what society thought was right. The behind the scenes of this new beginning wasn't easy. There were days of loneliness, of fear for the future, of crying hidden in my pillow. But there were also small achievements that, little by little, showed that life was blossoming again. The day I went out alone for coffee and felt pleasure in being with myself. The moment I sang again, even if alone in my room. The first time I was able to look in the mirror and recognize myself as someone whole, even without him. Over time, I began to understand that my story wasn't over. Divorce, which once seemed like the end of everything, actually became a gateway to a new journey. A journey where I learned to make more conscious choices, to value who I was in God, and to build a future that reflected who I truly wanted to be. This transformation wasn't instantaneous. There were many revelations along the way, hidden truths about myself that I had to face head-on. I discovered that I'd spent years trying to be the perfect wife, but forgetting to be just me. And, paradoxically, it was at the moment I lost that marriage that I found my true identity. Looking back today, I see that God never rejected me. He took me by the hand, even when I felt at my weakest, and showed me that His restoration doesn't depend on people's expectations, but on what He had already prepared for me. This freedom brought me a strength I never imagined I had, as if I finally understood that my faith wasn't tied to a marital status, but to a living relationship with Him. And it was in this process of reconstruction that I realized something powerful. To this day, I still hear phrases that sound like stabs disguised as advice. You should have fought harder. Marriage is forever. You gave up too easily. God could have restored you if you had waited. At first, each of these words felt like a painful reminder of everything I had already lost, as if I needed to prove to the world that my pain was legitimate, that my decisions weren't hasty. But over time, I realized these opinions came from people who had never been behind the scenes of my life, who had never heard the silent screams I gave at night, nor witnessed the stifled prayers I offered for an answer. There's a hidden truth that few have the courage to face. It's easy to talk about faith when it's not your story that's in pieces. It's simple to preach about perseverance when it's not your soul that's being destroyed day after day. That's why I've learned not to give so much weight to external voices. Often, these criticisms stem from a rigid mindset that confuses religiosity with blind obedience. But God didn't call me to be a martyr in an abusive relationship, but to live in freedom and truth. This journey taught me that difficult decisions always come at a price. Choosing to leave that marriage was one of the most painful choices of my life, but also the most transformative. I had to face the fact that I couldn't please everyone. There would always be those who would judge me, distort my story, and use verses out of context to condemn me. And it was in this confrontation with rejection that I found a liberating revelation. God's approval is worth infinitely more than any human applause. Still, I won't romanticize anything. There were days when shame seemed to crush me, days when criticism echoed louder than the voice of hope. Sometimes I wondered if I was truly on the right path, but it was precisely in those moments of doubt that God showed me, in unexpected ways, that He was with me, whether through a message sent by someone unaware of my struggle, or a word I read in the Bible that seemed to have been written just for me. Small signs that He was behind the scenes, taking care of every detail, even when I couldn't see it. And I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it. There will always be voices trying to dictate what is right or wrong in your life, but no one but God knows the depths of your pain, nor the paths He is paving for your healing. This mindset gave me the strength to move forward without the burden of other people's approval. Today, when someone tries to tell me I should have fought harder, I just smile inside. Not because I think I'm better, but because I know the truth I carry in my heart. I fought. I fought much harder than anyone imagines. I fought to save my marriage. I fought to maintain my faith. I fought to not lose myself in the midst of it all. But there comes a time when fighting means letting go, and it was precisely when I let go that I experienced true liberation. The reality is that there will always be those who only look at the outcome without knowing the whole story. There will always be those who talk about principles without understanding that behind every decision lies a broken soul struggling to survive. And it was with this understanding that I chose not to waste any more energy trying to justify my past to those who will never understand. Because my liberation wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about breaking the chains of guilt, shame, fear, and the need for approval. It was about admitting, before God and myself, that I deserved to live differently, that I had the right to a fresh start, and that His restoration isn't tied to human labels. And that's why, today, even in the face of criticism, I walk in peace. Because I know that my story is not defined by the judgments of outsiders, but by the hands of the one who rescued me when no one else could see me. And when I reflect on all this, I realize that there's still something much greater behind this journey. Today, when I look back, I see a completely different woman from the one who cried entire nights asking God for an answer. I'm not the same because I had to rebuild myself, piece by piece, amidst the chaos. Pain taught me what no sermon ever could, that God's grace isn't limited to our failures or the expectations of those around us. It reaches us exactly where we are, even when all seems lost. And it was in this process of rebuilding that I realized the silent transformation taking place within me. Gradually, bitterness gave way to hope, and shame was replaced by a profound certainty that I was not defined by my past, but by what God was still writing in my story. I learned that strength isn't about never falling, but about rising every time the world tries to crush us. Getting here wasn't easy, nor was it quick. It involved nights of prayer, tears, solitary decisions, and a silence that seemed deafening. But it was precisely in this silence that God spoke loudest. I discovered that He wasn't distant as I'd imagined, but rather guiding me behind the scenes, opening paths I couldn't yet see. Today, I'm stronger because I understand that vulnerability isn't weakness. On the contrary, it's in this place of sincerity with God that true healing happens. I've become more sensitive to other women's pain because I know how lonely it is to carry burdens no one sees. Every conversation I have, every story I hear, is a reminder that my experience wasn't in vain. My journey not only freed me, but also gave me a new purpose, to be a voice for those who still can't speak. And it's interesting to realize how the decisions we fear most can be the ones that most reveal who we truly are. Before, I thought my faith would only be valid if my marriage was restored. Today, I know that true restoration has happened. Within me, it didn't come in the form of happy endings like I dreamed of, but as an inner rebirth where God's presence became more real than ever. My mindset toward life has completely changed. I no longer hold myself captive to other people's expectations, nor do I carry the burden of justifying my choices to those who haven't lived my story. I've learned to appreciate the small victories, the ones no one sees, but that represent giant steps in our healing journey. Forgiving myself was one of my greatest achievements because I realized that God never looked at me with the same judgment I once held. Today, I know my story didn't destroy me. It revealed me. It showed me a strength within me that only emerged because I had to face my greatest pain. It showed me that I'm capable of reinventing myself, of starting over, of believing again. And most importantly, it showed me that there's an unexpected beauty in what they tried to make me believe was failure. I still hear nasty comments, sidelong glances, people trying to minimize my journey, but none of that defines me anymore. Because I discovered the hidden truth we so often ignore. What people think of us is temporary, but who we become through our struggles is eternal. This revelation has had a profound impact on the way I see everything around me. I walk more lightly today, but not because I don't have scars. They are here, and I carry them with pride, because they tell the story of a battle won, a battle that made me realize I'm not just a survivor, but a victor. And as I help other women find the courage to start over, I realize that every bit of my pain was used for something greater than I could have imagined. It's at this point in my journey that I understand. It's not about going back to who I was, but about becoming everything God always intended me to be. If I could look into the eyes of every woman who feels the ground crumble beneath her feet today, I would say, I know how it hurts. I know what it's like to feel your heart shattered, with the whole world judging your choices, and the feeling that God has forgotten you. I know what it's like to disappear, to no longer have to face the stares, questions, and opinions that only add to the weight you already carry. But I also know what it's like to be rescued by a grace so profound that no words can explain. I know what it's like to feel God picking up the pieces of our story with infinite patience, as He shows us that we are not defined by what happened to us, but by who we become after the storm. If you're there right now, feeling like you have no strength left, I want you to know that your pain is not too small for God. He isn't frightened by our tears, nor offended by our questions. He remains. And however silent it may seem, He works behind the scenes, opening paths you can't yet see. Perhaps today you can only see chaos, but believe me, there is a purpose being woven into every detail, even when everything seems to be falling apart. For a long time, I myself believed that my story was over, that divorce was the final straw, the definitive proof that I had failed. But I discovered a hidden truth that changed everything. God doesn't measure our faith by what we can save, but by how much we trust Him when all seems lost. The greatest transformation happens within us, when we stop trying to hold on to what no longer fits in our lives and decide to trust in the new beginning He has in store. It's not about ignoring the pain or pretending everything is okay. It's about walking through the valley, knowing there's something greater waiting on the other side. It's about allowing the most bitter experience to also become the most revealing. Because when everything falls apart, that's when we discover who we truly are and who we truly believe in. This journey isn't about being strong all the time, but about allowing yourself to be cared for, even when everything inside you just wants to give up. I know it's scary to imagine a different future. It's scary to admit that you have to close cycles, to make decisions that many won't understand. But it's in this place of surrender that new life begins to blossom. One day, without you realizing it, the weight that seemed unbearable begins to feel lighter. What was once just tears gives way to small smiles, and your heart, little by little, begins to beat with hope again. If I could give you one piece of advice today, it would be this. Don't compare yourself to anyone. Don't believe the lie that your story is less valuable because it didn't follow the script they expected. Every journey is unique, full of behind-the-scenes details that only you and God know. And it is precisely in these behind-the-scenes details that He works most powerfully. You don't need to have all the answers right now. You just need to take the next step, even if it's small, even if it's just getting out of bed tomorrow and believing that something good can still happen. Because it can, and it will. Today's pain won't be eternal, but the transformation it creates in you will be forever. And as you walk, know that you are not alone. There are so many of us who have been exactly where you are. Women who cried, who felt shame, who were judged, and yet they rose again. Your story can also be an instrument of healing, just as mine has been. It is in this encounter of pain and overcoming that we discover that we are stronger together, that hope is real, and that God's love is far greater than any fall we have ever experienced. And that's precisely why I say with absolute certainty, He's not punishing you. He's calling you to a new beginning, to a life where you no longer need to hide behind other people's expectations or carry guilt He never placed upon you. This fresh start may seem daunting now, but it's in it that you'll discover who you truly are and how much you can still flourish. I know how difficult it is to make the decision to break away from something that for so long you believed was your destiny. It's frightening to imagine a life outside of what seemed so definitive, and it's inevitable to feel fear of judgment, criticism, and losing everything you know. But the truth is that remaining in something that destroys you from within is not a sign of faith, it's a sign of imprisonment. God never called us to endure what makes us sick in the name of a semblance of holiness. He called us to live in freedom, to flourish in a place where true love reflects His love for us. There's a huge difference between fighting for something that can still be restored and sacrificing yourself in a relationship that's no longer lifeless. We often get stuck in the idea of suffering for love as if it were a virtue, when in reality, it's just fear disguised as devotion. I needed to understand that leaving wasn't giving up. It was finally believing that God had something better, even if I didn't yet know what it was. And, yes, many people will judge your choices. There will always be those who point fingers, who say you should have tried harder, waited longer, endured more. But no one but you knows the weight you carry in your heart. Only you know the tears no one saw, the prayers that seemed to never reach the ceiling, the days when just getting out of bed felt like a victory. That's why no one has the right to define what it means to fight hard enough for you. Seeking help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage. Having someone to listen, advise, and walk alongside makes all the difference. I needed people to hold my hand when I didn't even have the strength to pray. I needed wise counsel to see that my faith wasn't measured by how much suffering I could endure, but by the trust that God wouldn't leave me lost when I took the first step toward a new beginning. The hidden truth no one tells us is that, often, the greatest demonstration of faith is precisely letting go of what's killing us inside. It's leaving behind what seemed right to make room for what is true. And when we do this, we experience something only those who live it understand: the freedom of knowing we no longer need to carry guilt that God never placed upon us. Making this decision is scary, I know. It's like walking in the dark, not knowing what will come next. But it's precisely in this courageous step that things begin to change. I still remember the feeling of taking a deep breath and thinking, now, it's just me and God. It was at that moment that I began to see myself as a whole person, no longer as half of a broken relationship. There's nothing more powerful than realizing that our identity isn't found in other people's expectations or the flaws of someone who hurt us. It's found in who God says we are. And when this truth finally sinks from our hearts into our lives, the chains begin to fall away, one by one. You discover that you can say no to what destroys you and still remain a woman of faith, loved and welcomed by the Creator. So, if necessary, choose to leave. Choose to rise, even when afraid, even when you don't have all the answers. Choose to believe that God is not disappointed in you for wanting to live in peace, because He never called you to live imprisoned in something that steals your joy, your identity, and even your faith. He wants you to be free to love, to start over, to live a story that reflects His care and grace in your life. And when that day comes, you'll realize that everything that seemed like the end was actually the beginning of a new journey, not because it got easy, but because you finally understood that you no longer have to fight alone. When I look back and see the woman I was, the one who knelt on the cold floor and asked for something she never thought she would, I feel a mixture of pain and gratitude. Pain, remembering how lost I was, crushed by guilt, shame, and a sense of abandonment. But gratitude because, even when I believed I had strayed from God, He never did. I was that woman who, in the darkness of my soul, prayed desperately for a new direction in life. But today I am the woman who understands that God not only heard my cry, but also completely transformed my story. I discovered that our most sincere prayers, those that come out between sobs, may be confusing, filled with anger or hurt, but they are precisely the ones that tear our hearts before God. This is how He began to rebuild me. Little by little, I realized that my story was not a spiritual failure, but rather a journey of revelations, difficult choices, and a transformation that only happened because I had the courage to face the hidden truth I had been avoiding. I didn't need to save anyone or prove anything to anyone. I just needed to be healed. Today, when I pray, my request is different. I pray that women who are exactly where I was will find the courage to rise, to not accept a life of silent pain as their destiny, to believe they can begin again. I pray that each of them will discover that they are not alone, that God's love is not conditioned on a perfect marriage or a flawless life, but that He loves us amid our brokenness. And if this message touched you in any way, I'd love to hear about it. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched your heart most, or where in your story you felt most alone. Reading each story is not only important to me, it's also a way for us to create a space together where no woman feels invisible. Your experience could be the answer someone else needs to find the courage to take the first step. If there's anything powerful about this journey, it's knowing that our story, however marked by tears, can become an instrument of hope for others. I was that woman who longed for the end, but today I'm the woman who wants to see others resurrected to life, to freedom, to faith. This is the truth that moves me. God's love never fails, even when all seems lost. And that's why I keep sharing my story. So, more women know that pain isn't the end, but just a chapter in a journey that can be completely redefined. Because if He did it for me, He can do it for you too. And for so many others who still need to believe that there's a new beginning waiting for them.